In 1952, the future arrived. The de Havilland Comet was the world's first jet airliner, smooth, silent, and flying faster and higher than anything that had ever carried passengers. It cruised above the weather in a cabin pumped full of pressurized air. For 2 years, it was the most glamorous way to travel on Earth and the pride of British engineering. Passengers boarded in their finest. It slashed the time to fly to distant corners of the world. The jet age had a face, and it was British. And then, in 1954, comets began falling out of the sky. No warning, no mayday call. They simply tore apart at altitude and fell into the sea. There was no bomb, no storm, no pilot error. The cause was hiding in a shape so ordinary it was sitting in every airplane ever built. This is the story of how a corner brought down the jet age's brightest star, and why every airplane window has been round ever since. To understand what went wrong, you have to go up, way up. A jet cruises around 11 kilometers high. The air up there is far too thin to breathe, so the cabin has to be sealed and pumped full of pressurized air just to keep the people inside alive. That turns the fuselage into something it doesn't look like, a giant pressure vessel. The air inside pushes outward on every inch of the skin, thousands of tons of force trying to burst the tube open. On the ground, that pressure is gone. At altitude, it is enormous. The thin aluminum skin has to hold that difference every second of every flight. Hold it once, and the metal is fine. The danger isn't holding the pressure. The danger is letting it go, and then doing it all over again. Because here's the part that matters. Every single flight, the cabin pressurizes for the climb and depressurizes for the landing. So the whole fuselage swells slightly as it climbs, like a balloon, and shrinks back down when it lands. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. One flight, you would never notice. But an airliner flies thousands of them. Thousands of times. That metal skin is stretched tight and then relaxed. Metal does not like that. And the Comet was about to teach the whole world exactly how much it doesn't. January 10th, 1954. BOAC Flight 781, a Comet registered GA-LIP, climbs out over the Mediterranean near the island of Elba. Without warning, it breaks apart in mid-air. All 35 people on board are lost. The entire Comet fleet is grounded while engineers scramble for an explanation. They suspected everything: an engine fire, sabotage, a control failure. Dozens of modifications were made. With no clear cause found, the Comet was cleared to fly again. It lasted 2 weeks. April 8th, 1954. South African Airways Flight 201, Comet GI breaks apart near Naples. 21 more people are gone. 2 nearly new jets torn open at altitude within 3 months of each other. This time, the Comet is grounded for good. And Britain launches one of the most determined accident investigations in the history of flight, led by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The wreckage of the Elba Comet lay scattered across the floor of the Mediterranean, hundreds of feet down in the dark. The Royal Navy was sent to find it. Piece by piece, fragments of the airplane were dredged up from the seabed and shipped back to Farnborough. It was one of the most ambitious salvage efforts ever attempted. Over months, they recovered enough of the airframe to begin putting the puzzle back together. There, investigators did something extraordinary. They began to rebuild the airplane, pinning each salvaged fragment onto a wooden frame shaped like the fuselage. They were reading the wreckage like a crime scene, tracing the cracks backward to find where the failure had begun. The pattern pointed to one thing: the pressure cabin had ruptured from the inside. But suspecting it was not the same as proving it. To prove how, they would have to break a Comet on purpose without anyone on board. So, they built a tank, an enormous water tank, and they sealed an entire Comet fuselage inside it, completely submerged. Why water? Because they were about to pressurize that cabin over and over until it burst, and compressed air stores enormous energy. so an airburst would explode, destroying the evidence. Water barely compresses, so when the hull finally failed, it would simply split and leak gently, leaving the crack intact to study. It was the only safe way to watch a plane tear itself apart. Hydraulics pumped the cabin up to about 2¾ pounds per square inch above the outside pressure, a normal flight's load, then let it go. Again and again. Each cycle was one simulated flight. After the equivalent of thousands of flights, the fuselage failed. And when they drained the tank and looked closely, the crack told the whole story. By the time it gave way, that one fuselage had been pressurized far more than it ever would have been in normal service. The crack needed only a few thousand cycles to grow from invisible to catastrophic. It had begun tiny, at the corner of a squarish cutout in the skin, and grown a little with every single pressurization until the cabin could hold no more. The Comet hadn't been badly built. It was the victim of something the whole industry barely understood yet. The investigators finally had their answer. Now they had to understand it well enough to make sure it never happened again. Bend a paperclip once, and nothing happens. Bend it back and forth, again and again, and it snaps. You never added more force. You added cycles. That is metal fatigue. Each flex does invisible damage deep in the metal, and that damage adds up, flight after flight, until a microscopic crack forms and begins to spread. Every pressurization was one bend of the Comet's skin. The cruel part is that the Comet had actually been fatigue tested before it flew. A fuselage was pressure cycled thousands of times in a rig. It passed, but that very test may have hidden the danger. The test section had first been pushed to a high proof pressure, and that can toughen the metal around an opening, letting the test piece outlast the planes actually in the sky. So the aircraft was certified as safe, while a crack was quietly waiting in every fuselage, growing one flight at a time. And fatigue cracks don't start just anywhere. They start where the stress is highest, and stress has a favorite hiding place. Picture the force flowing through the skin of the fuselage, like water flowing through a flat sheet. Across a smooth, unbroken surface, that flow spreads out evenly. No single spot has to carry too much. But cut a hole in it, a window, a hatch, any opening, and the flow has to divide and go around. The lines of force crowd together at the edges of the hole. And at a sharp square corner, they pile up into almost a single point. The stress right there can be several times higher than anywhere else on the skin. Engineers call it stress concentration. It is one of the most important ideas in all of structural engineering. And here is the bitter irony. This was not new physics. The mathematics of stress concentration was already decades old. Engineers had understood since the early 1900s that a sharp corner in a loaded material multiplies the stress crowding around it. The knowledge existed. What was new was the combination. A thin metal skin, stretched and relaxed thousands of times by pressurization, with sharp cornered cutouts sitting right where the stress concentrated. No one had connected those dots yet. On the Comet, the cracks raced out from the corners of squarish cutouts in the skin, exactly where the math says the stress would be worst. Now watch what happens when you round that corner. The flow has nowhere to pile up. It curves smoothly around the opening, spread thin, and the peak stress drops dramatically. Same hole, same pressure. One change, the shape of the corner. That is the entire difference between a window that holds and a window that tears a plane in half. When the Comet was finally redesigned, the windows became smooth, rounded ovals. The skin was made thicker, and every cutout was carefully reinforced. But the damage was done. By the time the fixed Comet was ready, Boeing and Douglas had caught up. America took the lead in the jet age that the Comet had invented. The price the Comet paid was terrible. But the lesson it bought is everywhere now. Look at any airplane window today. Rounded corners, every single one. And it is not just windows. The same principle shapes the corners of your phone, the windows of ships, the doorways cut into bridges. Anywhere a material has to survive being loaded over and over. The lesson is also not a one-time fix. In 1988, a Boeing 737 flying over Hawaii, Aloha Airlines Flight 243, lost a huge section of its roof in midair to metal fatigue after decades of pressurization cycles. Astonishingly, the pilots landed it, with the loss of one cabin crew member who was swept out. It forced the entire industry to take aging aircraft and fatigue inspection far more seriously. Fatigue never stops trying. Every pressurized cabin in the sky is in a slow contest with it, held off by inspection, by tougher design, and by those rounded corners. A sharp corner concentrates stress. A curve sets it free. It took the brightest airplane of its age, and the lives lost aboard it, to teach us a lesson now hidden in plain sight. If you want more of the hidden engineering behind the things all around you, subscribe to Beneath the Wires. There is a new one every week.